Welcome to this afternoon's session that, as I'm sure you're aware, is being hosted by the Healthy Work Company. My name's Andrea Newton and I'm a trainer working for Heather at the Healthy Work Company, predominantly in the area of suicide prevention, but also in some leadership development stuff, particularly in organisations where they're looking at well-being as an issue. I've been in and around the training arena for more years than I care to remember, and I'm not going to share the exact number because that will then blow my cover, because I am really pretending to still be 27. However, been in and around for a long time, worked with literally thousands of people across hundreds of different organisations. At the moment, just to give you an indication, I'm working with the NHS, I'm working with the fire service, I'm working with the lovely people that patrol the motorways, and I'm also working with commercial organisations who are finally, and I say that with all respect, finally recognising that the workplace can indeed be a significant influencing factor. One of the things that we'll go on to learn about people who perhaps struggle with thoughts of suicide is that the workplace can indeed be a contributing factor. The work they do, the way they're managed, the hours, the pressure of that work. And obviously, one of the other factors that absolutely underpins suicide ideation is a feeling of loss. So if you're dealing with somebody who's perhaps looking at losing their job or facing redundancy, or perhaps where there's performance management issues and people are starting to get stressed. So there's lots of reasons why people in workplaces all over the world need to be paying attention to suicide prevention. And at the end of the day, if nothing else, it's about being a decent employer, a decent human being who recognises that health and safety isn't just hard hat, high vis and safety boots. Health and safety is very much as well about mental health and psychological safety. And it's becoming more and more the case that if the coroner's inquest discovers that the stress from the workplace had some form of contributing factor, I've been working with employers who are now involved in the inquests because the workplace has been named specifically as a potential issue that led to that person taking their life. Now, that's obviously quite an extreme situation. But the reason I share that with you is because I fundamentally believe every single one of us can make a difference to a person in crisis. You don't have to be a mental health expert. You don't have to be a counsellor or a therapist. You don't have to take on the problems that that person is dealing with. You need to learn to spot the signs, to be comfortable to have a conversation, and then signpost that person to help them get the help they need. And the big red flag that I need to wave up front is we need to stop associating suicide ideation purely and simply with mental illness. I need to tell you that more than half of the suicides in the UK are not people who are mentally ill. They are people who are simply overwhelmed by life. And therefore, every single one of us can make a difference to that person. And therefore, I am delighted that so many of you have chosen to join me this afternoon. And I do want to make sure that you get the best possible value from it. So in terms of today's session, we're due to be together for up to 60 minutes, during which I want to talk to you about some information that is suitable for anyone who wants to be able to make a difference. As I said, you don't have to be particularly qualified or capable or have any special ologies after your name. I also want to use the opportunity today to bust a few myths, because actually the myth, like only people who are mentally ill will have thoughts of suicide, is actually meaning that some people are falling between the cracks. Yeah. If you look at how we actually define mental illness and the label that we then put on it, a lot of people who are in crisis would fall far short of that criteria. For example, if I gave you somebody such as, let's imagine that I am a middle-aged menopausal woman. Now, I know it's hard to imagine because I am only 27, but do go with this just for the purpose of the story. Let's imagine that I am a middle-aged menopausal woman. Let's imagine for the last 10 years, I've been living in a coercive, controlling relationship. And let's imagine that actually that relationship has now disintegrated so much, it's becoming violent, it's becoming aggressive, it's becoming abusive. And so I take the decision to leave. And on leaving that relationship, what I discover is I'm going to really struggle financially because the coercive control I didn't know had gone as far as him transferring all our joint bank accounts into his sole name without my knowing. I also discover that in doing that, he's also transferred the house into his sole name, because when we took on the mortgage all those years ago, we ticked a box that said either party could make a decision without the knowledge of the other. I'm now in a state where for 10 years, my resilience has taken a battering. Recently, I've physically taken a battering. Financially, I'm in a bad place. I'm now homeless. I've got nowhere to go. My relationship has just fallen apart, and people now see what I've been hiding for the last 10 years that I was too ashamed to let them see. Question: would I be defined as mentally ill, worthy of medication and hospitalization if that were my story? Absolutely not. We need to stop thinking that people need to be mentally ill in order to have thoughts of suicide. Not everybody who's mentally ill will have thoughts of suicide. Not everybody who dies by suicide is mentally ill. So we do need to get past some of those myths and really help people to see that actually nobody is immune. Now, obviously, today what we're giving you is a very brisk and pacey overview of the subject. And we do obviously offer more in-depth and more detailed sessions that we tailor according to the role, the responsibility, what you as a business want to get from it. Everything from a 45-minute lunch and learn all the way through to a full day City and Guilds qualification in suicide prevention, if that's what you want. But I want to make sure that today isn't a sales pitch. I want to make sure that today does give you some value in terms of the time that you're willing to invest. But I also do need to clearly make it known that today what you'll get is a taste of and some information, but there is a lot more that we could go into. So just to set the scene, regardless of who you are, regardless of your role or your situation, whether you are indeed in an organization, commercial or otherwise, we do not need to have all the answers to make a difference. Sometimes people say to me, I'd be frightened to ask them, is everything okay? Because what if I don't know the answers? What if I don't know what to say if they tell me yes? Can I tell you this? You don't have to have all the answers. And actually, sometimes for some people, just knowing that somebody cares enough to ask and that gives me a safe place to offload how I'm feeling, that in itself can be massively therapeutic. If any of you are as old as me, which I very much doubt, but if you are, you might remember the kids' board game Buckaroo. Anybody remember Buckaroo? And it was that silly game where you put little bits of pieces on the back of the donkey. And if you happen to put a touch too much weight in one place, what happened? Game over. Yeah, the whole thing flipped. If you think about suicide in that way, it's a bit like balancing two sides of the seesaw. If on one side of the seesaw, I've got loads of heavy negative stuff, perhaps bereavement, perhaps relationship breakdown, perhaps I'm at threat of redundancy, doesn't mean to say I'm going to go on to have thoughts of suicide if the other end of my seesaw is nicely balanced with a loving family, positive social events, the opportunity for self-care, etc., etc. And that's why I say you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be word perfect. You don't have to be the expert in mental health or any of that to help people balance their seesaw. It could even be a 20-minute conversation that makes the difference for somebody. I know from my own experience, as little as 20 minutes has been the difference between life or death. So in terms of what do you do, how can you make a difference? Let's just have a look at the moment in terms of where we are as a nation. Some of you may be aware that the most recent statistics have been published in the last couple of weeks. And unfortunately, in the UK, the numbers are back at pre-pandemic levels. Now, we can read too much into that if we're not careful, because actually a lot of the numbers have been skewed because of the pandemic. Obviously, coroners' inquests, reports, etc. are delayed. So even though the number we've got is the number of deaths recorded in that year doesn't mean to say that that was the number of suicides that actually happened in that year. I'm working with families at the moment who are 3 years on and still haven't had an inquest into their loved one's deaths. Okay, so we need to appreciate that when we're looking at these statistics, we can never have a truly accurate, up-to-date figure because of delays. And especially if mental health services are involved, there are typically further delays while everybody gets their house in order and works out what they're going to say at the inquest. But there were 6,199 deaths by suicide recorded in the UK. And the reason that I say recorded is for it to be classed as a suicide, the coroner has to provide evidence of intention, which means that sometimes a suicide will be classed as a death by misadventure or some other narrative. It can even be, and this is important for those of you in organisations, certain community groups, religious, cultural beliefs, will hide the fact that it was a suicide. I did a lot of work recently with the Caribbean and African Health Network, and what they tell me is in some of their communities, suicide is such a taboo subject, it's considered the ultimate sin, and therefore the family wouldn't want that shame. One guy told me about in his ancestral village, suicide was such a shameful event that you had to get people from the next village to come and do the funeral, because if you were to touch the body, the sin would be transferred. So please be aware that in certain communities within the UK, people are going to be even less likely to talk about suicide, not because necessarily they're ashamed of their feelings, but because of those beliefs about it being that sin. And by the way, during this session, you'll never hear me use the phrase commit suicide. Okay, that's a phrase that we need to step away from. Suicide hasn't been a crime in the UK since 1961. So it's damn time we stopped making the commit connection. And also, if you come from a community where it's considered committing a sin, you can see why some people bereaved by suicide find that phrase offensive. So you'll hear me talk about people who've died by suicide, people who've taken their own lives. You will not hear me use that phrase committed. And I just invite you to think about the language you use around subjects like this, because for all you know, you're giving the wrong impression to somebody else, and they then think they can't talk to you about it because for you, this subject, is such. So 6,199 deaths by suicide recorded. Most of you will be aware, as it says in all the media, that the majority of deaths by suicide are male. In fact, 75% of the deaths in the UK are indeed men. Those of you that work in male-dominated industries, construction, for example, has the highest rate of suicide deaths by industry. However, what the media aren't as good at getting out there is, even though 75% of the deaths are male, twice as many women will attempt suicide as men. The numbers are the way they are because men are more likely to die, because men will often choose a method or means that's more fatal. Make sense? So twice as many women will actually attempt suicide. More men will die on that attempt. And also we know statistically that, men are less likely statistically to seek help when needed. Big boys don't cry and all of that nonsense. So there's all sorts of factors that potentially contribute. But I don't want you to see this as a man-only issue, because sometimes people are getting that impression from the media that our biggest concern is middle-aged men. And actually, what I need you to know is as many as 1 in 5 of us will have thoughts of suicide at some point in our lives. Just because we have those thoughts, though, doesn't mean to say that we'll necessarily act on them. Some people can have thoughts of suicide and live with it for years and years and years. Remember the seesaw that I talked about earlier, that at the time you thought, that's a bit of an odd reference. Somebody can have all of that negative stuff on the one side, but as long as that's being counterbalanced, perhaps by a supportive boss, perhaps an organisation that has access to an EAP, perhaps I've got a friendly GP that recognises, the help that I need. So people can have thoughts of suicide, but never act on them. There are, though, a couple of factors that do increase the risk of somebody acting, and I'll share that with you later. I need you to know that the most significant increase in suicide deaths in the UK over recent years has been young females. In fact, it's the highest number on record. By young females, we refer to the ages of 15 to 24. There's all sorts of reasons why that might indeed be the case. It's an area that I'm specifically looking into at the moment, because in some areas of the country, that number has increased by as much as 52%. So the media tells us all about the issue with male mental health and the number of male suicides, but actually the most significant increase in recent years has been young females. I'm a tutor qualified with the National Centre for Suicide Prevention Training. I'm not just somebody who's rocked up here because I'm one of Heather's mates. So I just want to let you know that I am completely allowed to be here. And actually, we believe the true statistics in terms of deaths in the UK over the last 12 months is probably 20% more than the figures suggest. Now, sometimes when I share that figure with people, 6,199, they go, well, out of a population of like 64 million, that's, it's only a small percentage. How about if I told you that's the equivalent of a jumbo jet full of passengers falling out of the sky every single month and killing everybody on board every month for 12 months? If that was happening, if literally every month in the UK, an aeroplane fell out of the sky and everybody on board was killed, do you think the government would be putting air travel further and further down the list of priorities? Do you think as a society, we'd simply be rolling our eyes and tutting? If that was happening in the aviation industry, you can bet your sweet life that there would be uproar and we'd be doing things about it. But that's the equivalent number of deaths that we have in the UK every year. And here we go. 10%, so in the region of 650 deaths, were workplace related. People who felt overwhelmed by the workplace, people who felt unfairly treated, people who had a combination of factors that led to them feeling that they couldn't cope with the life they were currently living. Not necessarily people that were mentally ill, don't forget. So statistically, we are not in a great place. In fact, every death is one too many. In fact, every death emotionally injures as many as 15 other people. By emotionally injure, I mean somebody who's negatively affected emotionally, psychologically by that death. Now, that could well be a member of the family or a close friend. It could be work colleagues. That could be the blue light worker who was first on the scene. That could be the train driver who happened to be driving the wrong train at the wrong time on the wrong track. But by emotionally injured, what we mean is, with a death by suicide, it's different than a death by any other means. A death by suicide leaves behind lots of difficult emotions. Often people have the question, why? Why did they do it? I just don't get it. Sometimes that turns into people feeling guilty. Should I have noticed? Could I have done something? Could I have done more? What if I'd only? Sometimes those emotions can be emotions of anger. How dare he do that? All that's happened now is the pain has transferred to us. And sometimes that anger then becomes shame. How bad am I to be thinking badly of someone who took their life? So can you see how the emotions following a death by suicide can be very complex? And actually what we know is anybody affected by a death by suicide is then 65% more likely to have thoughts of suicide themselves. If you're an organisation and you know that a member of your staff has lost a loved one to suicide, can I please emphasise that postvention is as important as prevention? Making sure that people get the help they need to deal with those difficult, often very painful emotions that losing somebody or discovering the person can leave. Postvention is as important as prevention. And actually some research in the States has demonstrated that you can reduce the risk of suicide by 7 times if people get appropriate suicide bereavement counselling afterwards. So a couple of things there for you to think about and to recognise there is definitely a ripple effect. Every one death touches, as we say, on average, emotionally injuring 15 people. But the ripples go wider. Every one death we know can potentially influence 132 people. And if you think about that as being a death of a celebrity that people don't necessarily know, but they relate to or connect with, that can also have little ripples in their well-being. So how are we doing so far? Give me a thumbs up. Are we all okay? Anybody feeling lost or confused? Anybody desperate to pretend they've lost their internet and dive off? Okay, so lots of information that I want to share with you, and particularly some research that I think, busts a few of those myths. First and foremost, people who are having thoughts of suicide typically don't want to die. They just want the pain to stop. People get to a point where they feel so desperate and hopeless about life, they feel that they no longer have the capacity to cope. And often when you get into that very narrow way of thinking, you believe that there's only two options: to live the life you're living or to end that life. But often in that state, people don't see it as dying. They see it as relief from the pain. Pain could be physical. It could be a person with a physical chronic injury or illness. Pain could be psychological. Pain could be emotional. Pain could be financial. And I think especially given every time you turn the news on at the moment, in between details of everything else that's happening, we get reminded of the cost of living increase. We get reminded of choices between eating or heating. We need to brace ourselves because there is a direct correlation between financial hardship and increased suicide ideation. People with a troubled mind, but they don't want to die. They just need that to stop. Now, here's another little myth that I need to bust. Lots of people believe that if somebody's having thoughts of suicide, you can't tell, you won't know, they'll keep it from you. Actually, statistically, 84% of people will let you know, consciously or unconsciously. And the reason that we don't always recognize it is because, firstly, we're not always aware of what the signs or symptoms are that we need to be looking for. Secondly, people may not directly use the language that says, I need help and I mean it. I think one of the issues we've got is we are quite casual in our use of language in this country. Would you agree? People say, oh, I'm really depressed. And they're not depressed. They're just pissed off because it's Monday, it's cold, it's raining, and they're on a diet. Yeah, that's not depressed. People use phrases like, I've lost the will to live. They don't mean that. What they mean is, my boss has given me an Excel spreadsheet that's got far too many formula in and I can't get my head around it. Yeah. So those two factors means that sometimes we might miss somebody asking for help. We might not recognize the red flags that they're waving. I need you today, though, to recognize that although we say hindsight is a wonderful thing, hindsight can also be quite cruel. If you learn something today that you didn't know before, please don't beat yourself up. Please just take hope from the fact that now you know, if you were to see it, you'd know how to react. The other thing that I need you to be clear about is that suicide is rarely the result of a one-off event or factor. It's more typically a build-up of complex combination of little things that together makes that person feel overwhelmed. If you imagine a big saw machine that every day cuts wood, and every day that machine deals with lots of little splinters of wood flying off. Those little splinters don't cause the machine a problem until they all clog up together and screw with the mechanism. Does that make sense? So it doesn't have to be a single one-off significant life event. It can be a complex combination of factors that slowly builds up over a period of time. And the more we know about our people, the more we understand about what's going on for them personally, and I don't mean that you should be stalking them, but the more we understand about them as people and what's happening in their lives, the better able we are to make a difference. Because sometimes all it takes is a conversation. Trust me, when you're in that place where suicide is on your mind, it's like being trapped in a toxic bubble with only your own thoughts for company. And because of the stigma that sits around it, it's difficult to ask for help. It's shameful. It's embarrassing. People are probably just going to say to you, oh, you know what? You just need a good night's sleep, a Kit Kat, and put some lavender oil on your pillow. Being caught up in that toxic bubble, sometimes all you need somebody to do is burst the bubble for you. Burst the bubble by enabling you to talk about the intensity that's going on in your head. Every single one of us has probably laid awake at 3 a.m. on our own and got really stressed about something fairly insignificant in the cold light of day. Anybody ever had that experience? Quick show of hands. It might be the washing machine's on the blink. It might be you need 2 new tyres for your car. It might be your kids going up to high school and you're worried about bullying. But at 3 a.m, that can feel like a really intense issue. Imagine if that intensity was there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you couldn't release it by saying to your mate, what do I need to do about the 2 new tires? Make sense? So sometimes just bursting the toxic bubble, being able to talk about how I'm feeling without risk of judgment or criticism or ridicule, or being told to, cup of tea and a Kit Kat and you'll be just fine. Because that's what makes somebody feel that suicide is their only option, when intensity builds to such a degree that they simply cannot see a way out. Now, in terms of some people being at greater risk of thoughts of suicide than others, what I want to share with you this afternoon is the fact that there are many different routes to that same outcome. Okay. And I want to share with you some information that I think is really important, because what this gives us is an idea of people who may be waving red flags. The first thing is recognizing that our biology can put us at greater risk of suicide ideation, thoughts of suicide. For example, did you know that women going through the menopause are at 7 times greater risk of suicide ideation, purely and simply because of the imbalance of hormones? For those of you not familiar with the menopause, it's basically a time in your life when estrogen levels drop. Estrogen controls serotonin, serotonin controls mood. And therefore, statistically, 1 in 6 women going through the menopause will think about leaving their job because of lack of self-confidence, anxiety, depression, etc., which in turn increases the risk of suicide by 7 times. Now, obviously, menopause isn't the only biological factor. Age, gender, sexuality, all of that comes under that category. And if we look at things like gender, we know that more than 80% of the trans community will be at risk of suicide ideation. So biology, look at the number of male deaths by suicide. The majority are aged between 45 and 49. What is it about men at that point in their lives that makes them more vulnerable to ending their life? Biology is definitely a contributing factor. Think about all the young people going off to university this week, going through puberty. Hormones are raging. It's their first time away from their families. They're having to work out who they are, where they fit, what their sexuality is, all of that stuff. And we know that university students can be very susceptible, very vulnerable. In fact, one university in the UK actually had 9 suicides in 1 year. So our young people are as much at risk as our middle-aged menopausal women. Psychology, people often think that this is all about mental health, and actually it does include disorders such as depression and anxiety. But by psychology, what we also mean is people who perhaps have low resilience, low self-esteem, low self-confidence, low self-worth. Think about young females with Instagram filters and the number of likes that I need to get, and how important it is to be accepted, to feel as though they belong. So things like self-esteem, self-worth, as well as the other mental health disorders, are definitely a contributing factor. Then if we think about a person's identity, by identity, I mean simply how I see me, how the world sees me, the labels that the world puts on me. My label could be anything from a neurodiverse diagnosis that I'm really uncomfortable with. My label could be that I'm transgender. My label could be that I'm a pregnant woman in the workplace, but it's something that separates me. It's something that makes me different. It's something that means inclusivity and feeling as though I belong is actually more likely to be isolating. Make sense? The fourth factor, which I'm sure you are aware of, is that a person's past history can also increase the risk of thoughts of suicide. Now, their past history could involve trauma or abuse. It could be violence. It could be childhood neglect. It could be sexual abuse. But did you know that children brought up in a formal care setting are at greater risk of suicide? The stuff like that we really need to be much more aware of as a society. So care leavers going out into the world on their own for the first time. And some of you may be familiar with how the care system works, and some of you may recognise that at 16 years of age, these people are basically expected to live and function and behave like fully functioning adults. Yeah. I wouldn't have done that to my 16-year-old child. He couldn't even bloody boil an egg. So things like formal care settings, things like victims who've experienced trauma or abuse, you're probably all familiar with the risk of suicide in veterans returning from active military duty. But what you may not know is that more veterans died by suicide than actually died in active service during the Gulf War. The trauma that they bring back with them is actually a greater risk to their well-being than the experiences they had of active military service. I mentioned to you earlier that if somebody is bereaved by suicide, the likelihood of them having thoughts of suicide themselves increases by 65%. And even somebody living with chronic illness or injury is at greater risk. In fact, the Diabetes Times last week suggested that every practitioner that supports a person with type 1 diabetes should be suicide awareness trained, because of the massive challenge that having that condition ongoing, managing your blood sugars, the physical impacts that diabetes type 1 can have, those people are at greater risk of suicide ideation. And finally, no surprises, things that might happen in the here and now that just tip the balance. Do you remember that seesaw? So I may have been bobbling along quite nicely as a middle-aged menopausal woman, perhaps not feeling great because of an abusive relationship, perhaps not got a great self-esteem because over those 10 years, he managed to persuade me that I was worthless, useless, all of that. But I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. I'm keeping my head above water. I've got a job that I love, that I'm passionate about. I'm surrounded by good people. Financially, I'm getting back on my feet because of my job. My son's at uni and he's doing really well. And because of my job, I can support him. And then guess what? Redundancy. My world just went into a massive downward spiral. Can you see how it's a complex combination of factors that builds up over a period of time that eventually can lead a person to that point where they believe that life is desperate, they feel hopeless, and they feel like a burden to others? Those are the three most commonly expressed emotions around suicide ideation: hopeless, worthless, feeling like a burden to others. Here's a question for you. If I'm already feeling like a burden to others and your mental health initiative tells me to reach out if I need help, I'm already feeling like a burden to others. How effective is telling me to reach out? That's like telling a drowning man who can't swim to kick harder. Yeah? We've got to get better at reaching in. We've got to get better at noticing when people are drowning, not waving. Because the sooner we can catch them upstream before they become so overwhelmed by their situation, the more able we are to help them take a step back on that continuum. Make sense? So with all that in mind, as I said, there are certain factors that absolutely increases the risk of a person having thoughts of suicide at some point in their lives. As I said, doesn't necessarily mean that they will act on those thoughts, but it definitely does mean the likelihood of those thoughts being present is increased. And that is by certain areas, that's by certain financial status, that could be even to do with the industry that they work in. Actually, in the construction industry, more men die by suicide than die by fall from height. And if any of you work in health and safety, especially in the construction industry, you'll know how much time and effort and training goes into working at height. Compare how much goes into that to how much that same industry puts into suicide prevention. We have a lot of work to do, my friends. So here's a little test for you. Knowing what you now know, what would a young Black male, by the way, young Black men are twice as likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than their white counterparts. Okay, so what about if it was a young Black gay man coming from Nigeria, where homosexuality is absolutely not okay? He's now in the UK as a professional footballer, desperately working hard to make sure that his true identity doesn't become known. But you know what? He's a young professional footballer. He's got money in his pocket. So, as a way of self soothing, making himself feel better, he spends some of that money on drugs. What does he have in common with a white, middle class, middle aged, menopausal woman who left a domestic abuse situation and found herself financial situation and being homeless? What do those two people have in common? Get it? On paper, they have nothing in common. Knowing what you now know, how many red flags are they waving? Make sense? Any questions? That's information I think we all need to know and understand, purely and simply so that we can look out for people drowning, not waving, and stop using a paper-based risk assessment that suggests, am I mentally ill or not? There are far more factors that as an organisation we need to be taking into account. And so we teach a very simple model around this. And as I said to you before, we run different sessions of different length and depth. For example, with the guys that do the M6 patrolling, what I teach them is if they find somebody on the bridge at night at 3 a.m, what to do. I work with HR departments and help them think about what sort of policy do they need to have in place so that not only their organisation isn't ever named in a coroner's inquest, but worst case scenario, how they should handle the issue. And we adapt that according to the audience and the industry. But it's a basic model that every single one of us can learn, and that's to spot the signs, start the dialogue, and therefore help save the life. This is not about you becoming the help, by the way. I'm not advocating that you give people your personal mobile number and tell them to call you anytime, day or night. I'm not suggesting that you take them home, wrap them in bubble wrap and keep them safe in your spare bedroom. You help them get the help they need. But you can only help them get the help they need if you understand what help it is that they need. And you'll only understand what help they need by engaging in rapportful, trusting conversations. But you need to spot, first of all, where somebody is struggling. And I know that some of you ask questions prior to the session. What sort of signs do we need to be on the lookout for? And it will vary hugely dependent on who that person is and what their normal behaviours and characteristics are. Because there will be things that we might see that are different. Somebody might be withdrawn, for example. Somebody might not connect with the group. Somebody might be hanging back during the lunch or not contributing in meetings. But equally, if people are putting a mask on it, it can almost feel as though their behaviour is a little bit over the top. Yeah. Behaviours could include things like poor personal hygiene, drinking more, not being able to sleep. Behaviours could be saying elaborate goodbyes, getting their affairs in order, talking a lot about death and dying. There's all sorts of physical clues. People behaving recklessly, sexual promiscuity, driving recklessly because they've no care for their own life. The sort of language that we might hear, people might talk about being at the end of their tether, not being able to cope. And we might just see that as they've had a bad day with the kids and they need a good holiday. Language could be almost indifferent, numb. I did a lot of work with the advisors at the Citizens Advice Bureau in Salford, and they were saying how they found it shocking that sometimes people talk about suicide in the way that they might talk about going to Asda. Because once a person has resigned themselves to that being their only choice, emotionally, that typically is how we might describe it. So the language, we need to be picking up on that. And I always say to people, listen to understand, not to reply. In the busyness of business, when you're going about your jobs and emails are dropping and phones are ringing and clients are demanding, we listen to reply. We need to get better at listening to understand. And then we can start to notice better emotions. Emotions, the obvious ones, I'm sure you'd say, sad, depressed, anxious, mood swings, all that kind of stuff. But emotions that we might also experience, somebody might seem to be on an incredible high. You know, sometimes when they interview people and they say, oh, I only saw him last night. I never thought he was going to kill himself. He was completely on top of his game. And often that's because a person has resigned themselves and they're feeling a sense of relief that the pain will soon be over. So if you're dealing with somebody who's been struggling for a little while and then almost overnight, as if by a miracle, they seem to be on top of it, what that may be an indicator of is they've made a decision, they've got a plan, and already the weight is lifted. Make sense? And in terms of what we might learn has happened, tiny little things. It could be a significant life event, such as a bereavement or a redundancy or a breakdown in relationship. I took a call from a guy who told me he was having thoughts of suicide. And when I asked him, what had happened, what had changed that day, he said to me that this morning he'd burnt the toast. Now, burning the toast is hardly a reason to end one's life. And so I said to him, talk to me a little bit more about your situation. What's been going on? And what he shared with me was that he'd recently been involved in an accident where he'd had some quite life-changing injuries. And that now meant that he was reliant on a carer coming into his home on a daily basis. This morning, he had indeed burnt the toast. But to him, what that represented was the fact that he couldn't go back to his proper job. He couldn't even jump in his car and go to the shop and buy another loaf of bread. So do you see what I'm saying about the little things? Listen to understand, not to reply. Because actually, in that situation, if he'd have said to somebody, I'm really struggling today, and they said, why, what's happened? And he said, I've burnt the toast. Typically, what would a person's response be to that? Oh, don't be daft. It's hardly here nor there. Have cornflakes instead. But if you're somebody that's in those depths where hopeless, worthless, and feeling like a burden are regular experiences for you, that final feeling that I can't even go to the shop and buy a loaf. What has my life become? So spotting the signs is one of the things that we train people to do. Help them to recognize where people are drowning, not waving, and then encourage them to engage in meaningful dialogue. Now, the first thing that you want to do is obviously build that person's trust. You want that person to feel comfortable with you, to perhaps share with you the biggest secret they've ever carried. So we need to think about what to say and what not to say. And in the training that we do, we spend quite a bit of time on this so that people realize that phrases like, you're not going to do something silly, are you? Are really not helpful. Silly, that's when you find a fabulous pair of shoes, but you only buy them in one color. That's silly. Silly isn't talking about ending your life. And if we're using language like that, potentially what we're doing is putting another level of judgment on an already heavy burden. So we talk about the language that we should use, the language that we should not. We talk about the importance of connecting, building rapport, getting the trust for that person. And perhaps by giving an example that you've observed about them that's causing you that concern. I noticed in the meeting this morning that you weren't your usual self. You didn't contribute in the way that you often do. And when I started thinking about it, I realized that, it's been like that for a while now. I know you lost your mum recently as well. And so I just wanted to catch up and just see. Do you see where I'm going? I've given you a factual reason for my concern. I'm not judging you. I'm not criticizing you. I'm not labeling you. And that could be the way that I lead into then asking questions to better understand. What's been going on for you recently? What is it that's making you feel this way? And that gives me an opportunity, as I say, to establish what the issues are. Because only then can I help them get the help they need. Not everybody needs a bloody referral to their GP with a prescription for sertraline, thank you very much. Not everybody is going to need psychological or emotional support. Some people will need practical help. Did they know that the Citizens Advice Bureau offer free debt management counselling services to people who are struggling financially? Did they know that their kids' university has a student finance office where they can help them talk through if they've just been made redundant and they can't support their kid anymore? Sometimes it's the practical things that people need to get that seesaw back in balance. So we need to approach it with no judgment, no criticism, and no language that suggests that. Telling me that there are people dying in the Ukraine doesn't resolve the fact that I'm petrified that my kid's going to get kicked out of uni because I can't pay his fees because I've just lost my job because I work for a company that during COVID went down the pan. Get it? Help them get the help they need. And as I said to you earlier, sometimes it's just a human connection, just having an opportunity to get that intensity out of your head There's a story, if you want to go and Google it, the guy does a fantastic YouTube video. His intention, John Kevin Hines, was to take his life off the Golden Gate Bridge. And all the way there, he said to himself, if somebody just makes eye contact, if somebody speaks to me, if somebody connects with me, I'll ask for help. I'll ask for help. I won't do it. And he spent about 45 minutes pacing up and down that bridge, pacing. A lady approached him and he says he remembered thinking, oh, thank heavens. And actually what she said to him was, could you take a photo of me and my family on the bridge, please? He says in that moment, he realized just how meaningless he was to the world. Now, thankfully, he didn't die, but he says it was the longest 4 seconds of his life, because when he jumped from the rail, as soon as he let go, he knew that he didn't want to die. He just needed human connection. So please never underestimate the power of a single conversation in the fight against suicide. Every single one of us has the capacity to make that difference. And please don't be afraid of the word suicide. Stop using euphemisms like something silly, something stupid. You're not going to hurt yourself. Get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And sometimes people say to me, I can't ask them if they're having thoughts of suicide. I might put ideas in their head. Let me tell you, all of the evidence-based research from the last 30 years tells us you will not put the idea in their head. What you will do is psychologically give them permission to empty their head. Yeah? If you come to me and you build that rapport and you start to engage and you discover that there's all sorts of stuff that's going on for me right now, and then you're able to say to me, Andrea, it sounds as though you've got an awful lot going on at the minute, love. And I know that when that happens for people, sometimes they can have thoughts of suicide. Is that happening for you? By you using the word, you are psychologically giving me permission to talk about the biggest secret I've ever carried. By you using the word directly, what you're saying to me is, I'm not scared of this. I know about this. This is a human condition. It happens. Actually asking directly is a protective factor and is more likely to help somebody get the help they need. It's more likely to, bear with me a second, I'm just about to be interrupted by a 32-kilo lurcher, but don't let it panic you. It's more likely to give people the opportunity to say, well, actually, yeah. So ask directly, get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Obviously, I don't want you waltzing up to somebody in the street and going, Aya, you look a bit rough. Are you having thoughts of suicide? You know, that really wouldn't work. But build a rapport, engage in dialogue, understand what the issue is, but don't be afraid of the word suicide. One of my clients that I was working with, they had a guy who, unfortunately, they lost to suicide. And when his wife came back to work, because his wife works in the same business, the HR manager said that everybody was like, didn't know what to say. And she, as a HR manager, was doing they do like a return to work interview. I don't know whether that's something that you guys do. And she said they spent 50 minutes in that return to work meeting and nobody used the word suicide. Now, if you're the person bereaved by suicide, nobody wants to name it, nobody wants to talk about it. How isolating does that feel? So can you see why a person bereaved by suicide struggles with difficult emotions and psychological challenges and 65% increase of thoughts of suicide themselves? Guys, get better at it. Really useful conversations matter. And if somebody says to you, no, I'm not having thoughts of suicide, and you believe them, absolutely fine. Just let them know that you're only asking from a position of concern. And if they were ever in that state, please know that you're there for them. If they say no and you don't believe them, because, you know, as human beings, we do that thing, don't we? You're all right. I'm all right. Are you all right? How was your weekend? Yeah, it was fine. How was yours? We do that social exchange. So we're actually conditioned that when people say, are you all right? That what they're expecting us to just say is yes. So sometimes people might say no, and actually they're not. The rule is ask twice. Are you sure? I'm not being nosy. I'm just asking from a place of concern, because I noticed that last week you didn't come to Friday night drinks at 8 o'clock and you never miss that. You're always there. And then I started thinking and I realized that actually you've not been to that since your marriage broke down or whatever. Ask twice. And if somebody says, yes, I am having thoughts of suicide, please don't panic. Don't get all stressed. Don't say things like, oh no, promise me you won't do anything, because that's a further burden. What you need to do is acknowledge, validate. I'm really sorry to hear that, but thank you for telling me. I'm really glad you've told me. How long have you been feeling that way? We're not getting into diagnosing or advising, okay? What we teach is then getting into how to help that person stay safe until they can access the help that they might need. All right. So we move into that conversation. We move into, thank you for telling me, talk to me about what's been going on. Have you spoken to anybody else about how you're feeling? What sort of things do you think might be useful for you? And all the time, we're listening to understand. We're using language that's not judgmental. And we are developing that trust with that person. We are not trying to fix them. We are not qualified or capable of doing so. Our job is to help them get the help they need by listening, by understanding, and by signposting. And that's where TED is a fantastic little model to keep in your head. Tell me, talk to me, explain to me, describe to me, TED. So this is the kind of stuff that we teach on the workshops that we run. And we teach people to not put additional pressure by saying ridiculous things like, promise me you won't do anything, but by simply asking the person to press pause. Sounds to me as though you've got a lot going on at the minute. You've just told me that you're not sleeping. You're drinking more than you'd like to. And actually the world's getting on top of you. Now isn't the time to be making decisions. How about if we just press pause and together, let's have a look at other options that might be out there. Just press pause and let's have a look at different resources that you might find useful to help you deal with your not sleeping, bereavement, whatever it might be. Because what we're not doing, folks, is we're not removing the option of suicide from them. Yeah. What we're asking them to do is simply press pause. And that's when we'll then teach you how to put together a safety plan. How do you help that person stay safe until they can access the help they need? Because let's be honest, I'm not going to pretend that the systems in this country are fabulous. In fact, I'm not even going to pretend that they all work. And you may find that somebody does need particular help, and it might be counselling, it might be CBT, it might be they need an appointment with financial services or whatever, and they might have to wait for it. So how do we help them think about their own safety and well-being during that time? Because we know there are certain factors that will increase the risk of a person moving from having thoughts to acting on those thoughts. As an example, if somebody were to tell you that they're drinking, the involvement of alcohol increases the risk of thoughts to action by 8 times. So what are the questions that we need to ask them around their alcohol consumption? How do we need to help them think about those risk factors so that they do stay safe? And that's where we need to have better understanding of different resources that are out there. Some of you may work for fantastic organizations where you've got EAP, employee helplines, all that kind of stuff, which is great. But actually, what else have you got? What else are you aware of? And, we've put together a pack that I call really useful resources that covers everything from alcohol to refugee status. And that's about you signposting people and not just sending them all to their GP. The majority of people will not get any benefit from going to their GP. Did you know GPs are not routinely trained in suicide ideation? So, that's the kind of work that we are involved with, and, really helping people have those conversations that can save lives. And I do want to remind you, you do not have to be word perfect. You don't have to have all the answers. You certainly don't need to become their therapist or counsellor or take them home and keep them safe. You just have to be able to confidently have a conversation that bursts the toxic bubble and that gives them an opportunity to release the intensity so that together you can create a plan of action. Because often when a person is trapped under thoughts of suicide, the emotional side of the brain takes over. And if any of you have ever been there where emotions kick in, your emotions are really good at lying. You're a terrible person. Everybody hates you. Nobody likes you. Nobody loves you. This is why this has happened. And through our conversation with this person, we help them reconnect with their logical brain so that they can think logically, rationally, so that they can put a plan together. Please remember, people don't want to die. They just want the pain to stop. And if we can help them find a way of reducing that pain, we can help them find a way of stepping back from the edge. A couple of you sent through questions prior to today's session. I feel as though I've answered most of them. Somebody asked, though, what if there's no obvious signs? I'm hoping now that you understand about those 5 different circumstances that you will start to appreciate. If you're dealing with a member of your team that's just come back from sick leave, or they've just been off on bereavement leave, or they are dealing with a relationship breakdown where they're being refused contact with their kids, and so financially they're a bit strapped because they're now paying for themselves and their family to live elsewhere, and actually they've taken to drinking as a way of helping them sleep at night. I'm hoping that what you now understand is that the flags are always flying. We just need to spot them and get better at understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, a couple of minutes. If anybody has any final questions, thoughts, or comments, please.
Well, Andrea, I'm gonna come in. I am so proud to work with you. I really am. I think that was absolutely fantastic. I learned.
I said that, Heather. People normally say I don't bring the biscuits often enough.
But honestly, what you packed into an hour there, and I've been dealing with this exact scenario myself with my friend in France, and you've been really supporting me with that. I mean, I train in sort of well-being conversations, but I always felt that this was sort of outside of my purview. And actually, I now understand that it's not. So thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate it. To everyone that's been asking, a recording will be available. So we will send the recording round to everybody. Would be grateful if you'd answer this survey. I've popped one in the chat box. I'm just popping it in again. It's like 1 minute, but it just tells us what you thought, and might give Andrea a little bit of testimonials that she can use. But thank you so much. Thank you all for attending as well. Really good. She's so engaging and honest. You're absolutely right. She is. That's what I love about her.
Yeah, I'm no good at lying, so unfortunately you get warts and all. Okay, guys, thank you. I really do hope you found it useful.
Hand up, Andrea. I'm not sure whether Jenny
come
off mute.
Hi ladies, hi Andrea and Heather. Thank you firstly so much for such an informative and useful session. So much shared there that definitely give us a lot to reflect on and food for thought. So working from Heathrow, obviously we have a very large multicultural organisation and many colleagues from lots of different backgrounds. You mentioned earlier, Andrea, that for some colleagues from certain cultures, it can be very difficult for them to talk about their feelings. I was just wondering if you did have any sort of advice on anything that we could do as an organisation that might encourage some colleagues who are reticent for a whole range of reasons to sort of open up and share their feelings.
I think it's about you putting your big girl pants on as a business and letting people know that, if anybody is struggling in any way, shape or form, and please don't just repeat the reach out message. Make sure that your managers, your team leaders are able to spot the red flags early on, and make sure that as an organisation, you're creating a climate where people can talk about this sort of stuff. Because, people from certain communities, like a lady that I was dealing with from the Southeast Asian community, she wouldn't even say the word suicide. And so we had to find a way of talking about the topic where actually we weren't talking directly. But I think it's about creating a climate where actually it's okay, and where managers can spot, this guy is behaving a bit differently today. It's not like him to be late. It's not like him to be off sick for trivial things. I know that they've just had a big funeral, just picking up on things and actually engaging in conversation. One of the things that frustrates me with organisations is the number that spend huge amounts of money on initiatives, but actually don't create the culture for that initiative to grow and thrive. We need to stop doing Free Fruit Friday and Wellness Wednesday and actually create a culture where our leaders engage with, notice and talk to people more frequently, more readily, more openly. Sorry, Jenny, there isn't one of them that you can buy in a box at Boots, I'm afraid.
No, that's absolutely fine. As you say, I think it's all bringing it back to creating that safe environment, isn't it? And making sure that your people, leaders, look out for the signs and create that space. Yeah.
And make sure your managers have that knowledge and understanding, because if they're managing these people day to day, they're closer to them, they understand them more. But if they don't know that, for example, somebody from that background would never admit to having mental health problems or indeed to thoughts of suicide, if they now know that, they can at least be more observant and more aware.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Any other questions? Nobody asked me any on geography. I don't know anything about geography. No? All right.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you all very much for coming.
Go and do marvellous things in the world.
We'll try. Thank you.
See you guys.
See you.